All right, welcome back to the HDR Masterclass, and in this segment we're going to continue our discussion of tone mapping. What we're going to do is we're going to step down through the adjustments panel of Photomatix Pro, and we'll address each one of these controls. Now, I'm not going to get so detailed on all of these controls that it's going to give you a headache. We're not trying to do that. We're not trying to get you to a point where you master every one of these controls. And I'll be very honest with you, you're going to look at these controls for as you work with HDR photography, and from one image to the next, you may say, well, what was that? What can I do with that? What does that do? And you know something? What I have found and what I have always recommended is don't get too caught up in trying to remember all of the technical details in HDR photography, and especially in tone mapping. Well, I mean, like, don't even get too caught up in the whole field capture technicals, because it really comes down to just understanding ultimately what you're trying to do, where you're going. It's understanding some processes like we had talked about in the field capture. If you understand what it is that you're trying to do generally, and you follow some best practices, and you practice, all right, so that you become familiar with it, you've touched it before, you've done that before, this didn't work as good for you, or better yet, you found a better method for you based upon your own experience, your camera, the scene that you're dealing with. I mean, always inject some variety. Always try and test. Never think that there has to be one way. But the reason I bring that up, because I want to impress upon you that these controls do not necessarily need to be remembered. You don't need to be a scientist on all of these controls, because you're going to have the opportunity to tweak them, test them, and see what happens. And that really is the whole beauty about the thing. You're not having to give a presentation for anybody. You can tweak a setting. Well, that doesn't look right. I don't like that. You tweak it back another way, and that's okay. That's experimenting. That's learning, and that's what you should always be doing. All right, let's take a look at the adjustments panel in Photomatix Pro. Now, again, I'm not going to get so detailed here that you're going to get lost and we're going to take hours to talk about this, but I want to give you a general idea of what it is that you're doing. Let's take the first one here. All right, now that little control, that's a little slider control. That's how Photomatix does it. And you take it with your mouse and you slide it back and forth, and you put it over here, and you see the results in your preview, and you don't like that, you try something else. And of course, multiple sliders will have an impact on how your image looks, and then you go to another slider and that has an impact, and that slider may actually undo or change or modify what the other slider did. So it's really a process of kind of settling it in, experimenting, and then ultimately winding up with an image that you like. But this particular control here, the strength they call it, that is the amount of enhancement, all right, on the contrast and the detail within the image. If you recall what contrast is, it's a difference in intensity, all right, from one pixel to the next, all right. And what you're doing there is, with the strength control, you're actually modifying the contrast and the detail in the pixels within that image. Now, let's see, let's go to the next one here, the saturation, the the color saturation. That is where you're actually controlling the saturation of the RGB, red, green, blue channels. You're actually able to saturate or heighten the intensity of the colors within that image. So that'll give you an opportunity to deal with the saturation. All right, and let's look at the next one here. This is where you're actually able to control the dynamic range of the mapped image. Now, the dynamic range, if you recall, is the range between the blacks, or the shadows, and the whites or the highlights. So that gives you the ability to apply kind of a dynamic range shift or adjustment across the entire image. And I do want to mention here that each of these controls here is affecting your entire image. It's often referred to as a global setting. So if you make that tweak here for there, you're affecting the entire image. So these are global settings or image-wide settings, however you want to phrase it. All right, and then this next one here, you're applying the amount of contrast that is applied to the detail. Again, global. All the pixels in your image are affected by each of these settings. All right, so that's the amount of contrast that's being applied to the detail. All right, we don't want to get too caught up in all of this. This next control is actually affecting the overall look. All right, it's kind of it will adjust light intensity within the scene. I generally think of it as more of a look, more of a styling, all right, of your image. Experiment with these settings to see what they look like, and certainly in the Photomatix front end. Now I'm not showing it here, but it's somewhere down in this area. They give you a fairly detailed explanation of what each of these controls are when you set focus to that particular control. All right, so another pretty good control is this one right here. All right, this is where you're actually able to control or adjust or modify the contrast that is applied to the highlights, all right, globally within the image. And the highlights, of course, as you probably already know, those are the high tones. Those tend to be more towards the white side of your histogram, as we've talked about in the past. Well, here with Photomatix Pro and with many other software HDR packages, you're actually able to confine the control of the contrast in the high tones, which is pretty cool. Okay, this is the maximum value of the tone mapped image. All right, and it you can kind of think of it as the white point where you're actually able to kind of artificially introduce like a clipping, all right, where you're actually, if you recall from clipping, clipping and HDR capture is the loss of pixel information. Well, you may actually want that. You may actually want to take your whites and reduce them so that they're not as white. So it's giving you, and that's why they say overall, the maximum value of your tones. You can actually introduce a clipping effect here in your controls. And the nice thing about that is that you get to decide if that's what you want to do. We can also control the minimum, all right, or we could actually introduce a clipping on the black side, all right, or on the shadow side if that's what we choose to do. So the nice thing about this is that you're doing a field capture. You've come back with, let's say, a sequence of images. They're merged together, aligned, deghosted, and now you have ideally you have the full dynamic range, or all of the light levels of that particular scene were captured. And now you come into tone mapping here, or I should say processing of your image as a 32-bit. Now this is cool. Now you get to decide if you're going to introduce clipping on the highlight side or clipping on the shadow side. You get to decide. But here's the nice thing about this. Because you did a really good capture, you captured all the dynamic range of the scene, all the light levels, you're actually in a position where you have the light intensity, the pixel information by which you can decide how you're going to process that. And if you choose to introduce clipping, in other words, to eliminate some of the highlights or soften the highlights or reduce the light intensity of certain types of pixels, well, you have that choice because you have the full dynamic range to work with. All right. Now, you also have the ability to adjust or modify the midtones. So the midtones, as you probably already know, that's going to be the tones that reside between the black and the white. Those are midtones. You have the ability to actually adjust the brightness, all right, of those midtones using your settings. Now, let's see. All right, so here, now you can adjust the color temperature. This is really cool. I mean, you could just take, the temperature, the color temperature. Look that up sometime when we get a chance to get a better handle on what temperature does. But it allows you to shift all of the colors, the RGB colors, simultaneously. All RGB are affected simultaneously. You can shift the color tone, all right, or the temperature globally. Keep in mind, everything we're doing here is global across that whole image scene. All right, and over here you can even do things like you can do enhancement of the very, very small details. Very small details. You can actually apply an enhancement to the details. And you can reduce the contrast of the shadows. You can actually in the shadow, the darker tones of your image, you can actually reduce the contrast and basically kind of soften the shadows. I like that particular setting because it allows me to adjust the shadows so they're not as sharp. They're more evenly toned. They're not as contrasty. They're not as black, if you will. All right. And very often that will actually prove to be a very handy particular adjustment. And of course you can also control the saturation, the color saturation, and that control will actually confine your desaturation or saturation of colors within the shadows. It confines it to the low tones. And then elsewhere you can actually confine your saturation to the high tones. So I think you're getting a sense here that when you're working with the settings that we've been talking about here in Photomatix Pro, and you'll find most of these settings in most of the HDR software, I think you're getting a sense that you're able to work with the image globally. You're able to work in isolation of the shadows or the low tones. You're able to work in isolation of the mid-tones. You're able to work in isolation of the highlights. So you're able to actually work in these different tonal levels. Now, perhaps this is a good time for me to remind you that your 32-bit image is giving you tonal values of, what is it, 4.3 billion potential tonal values for each pixel within your image. And as I think you're beginning to see here, because we have such tonal range to work with, we're actually able to work with our images so where we can be adjusting and modifying these tonal values. And because we have such greater latitude in the tonal values, we can actually do more with them. Can you imagine trying to do all these adjustments on an 8-bit, 128 tonal values? You just don't have the range to work with. Now here in a 32-bit, we have a tremendous amount of tonal values that we can work with, and therefore we can do more with our image. So, now, we are going to actually do this. I'm going to, in the next segment, I'm going to be actually sitting to Photomatix Pro, and I'm actually going to take an image, a scene, a file that's been merged. We're not so much concerned with the merging, the alignment, and the deghosting. But once I have my 32-bit file, I want to actually go through here in real time with a screencast and actually show you what the tone mapping process is all about. Again, I'm not trying to teach you, or I won't be trying to teach you every little nuance. I'm not going to try to make you a scientist on all of this stuff, but I want to give you a good springboard. I want to actually show you tone mapping in real. And I'll show you where I may make a tweak, a setting. All right, I don't like that. Go do something else, you know. It's experimenting, it's trying, it's testing. I doubt very much that you're ever going to get to a point where you can sit to your 32-bit image, whether it's Photomatix Pro or some other software. I doubt very much that you're going to be able to sit down and just know exactly what you're going to do and exactly which setting to adjust and exactly how everything is going to look, you know, before you actually even do it. Really, working with HDR in post-processing, in tone mapping, is really a series of experiments, tests, trying it, tweaking it, seeing what it looks like, seeing if that's what you like, seeing if one setting had an impact on another setting, that had an impact on another setting. So it really is a matter of kind of playing it in. I don't mean playing with it, but kind of tweaking it in, settling it in, getting yourself to a point where you've got an image that you like. And that really is the key. So, what we're going to do in the next segment is we're going to sit down, we're going to do a screencast of Photomatix Pro, and we're going to work with this same image that we have right here. We're going to step through it and then finish that up, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion and conclude our discussion of tone mapping. So brace yourself. We're going to do a screencast, and here it comes. I'll see you there.